Welcome and good afternoon. Do you hear me out there? Yes, you do. Yes, thank you. My name is Cecilie Felicia Stockholm Banke. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS, also head of our foreign policy and diplomacy department. And I'm extremely happy to see this many people here today for this afternoon seminar on atrocities in Ukraine, on how to prosecute these, if there are crimes. We are talking about crimes. How to prosecute, what kind of crimes are we talking about? And for this important endeavor, we have invited a number of experts. We have 2 experts here from DIIS, and then we have also invited 2 experts who really have experience in working with trials and also defining the kind of crimes that we are talking about. So let me first start with introducing our panel. And after that, I will play a short sentence. It's kind of a little, there's some noise here in my, is it okay out there? Yeah. After introducing the panel, I will play a small clip from an interview done last week by CNN anchor Amanpour. And it's an interview with Benjamin Ferencz, who was a prosecutor during the Nuremberg trials back just following the Second World War. He was then 27 and he's now 103. And I think what he says here kind of coins very well what we are talking about here today. But first, allow me to introduce our panel. We will have Astrid Kjeldgaard, who's a professor MSO Special Obligations at the law faculty, Copenhagen University, and she will be talking about the legal definitions of atrocity crimes. And following Astrid, we will have associate professor at Aarhus University, expert on the Balkans, Christian Axboe Nielsen, who has also a very long experience working with international trials, and in particular he's been with the ICTY in The Hague for many years, so he's also an expert, as I said, on ex-Yugoslavia and on the Balkans. And then following Astrid's and Christian's short presentations, which both will be focusing on the legal aspects, we will have Robin, my colleague here at DIIS, senior researcher Robin Mayshot, who will talk about sexualized violence in war and how it can be prevented. I know that it was a little bit optimistic putting this question to you, Robin, but you promise that you will try to address it a little bit. And Robin and I, we have for many years been working with in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, which we have been doing since, I don't know, 15 years or something here at the Danish Institute for International Studies. And so did our great colleague Johannes Lang, also senior researcher here at DIIS, and he will be talking about the psychological mechanisms behind atrocities. Each of them will do a short presentation of 10 minutes, and then you will have an opportunity to ask questions and also participate in a discussion. In total, it will be 1.5 hours. But let us start with listening to Benjamin Ferencz here. I hope we will start.
For his made history.
Mr. Ferencz, when you see what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, you know, we also have found ourselves scenes of bodies summarily executed, just the worst horrors as the Russian forces retreat from around Kyiv. What do you think all these years later, given what you hoped would be the case in holding that kind of crime accountable back in the Holocaust?
I am heartbroken. I have spent the rest of my life after the Holocaust trying to create a world of peace and harmony for everyone, regardless of their race or creed. And we've been making some progress in that direction by creating new international criminal courts, by teaching humanitarian law in universities. But to see it happening again, very similar, kids being shot, homes being blown up, it pains me to see that we have learned so little from the Holocaust and from the trials. I hope that we will come to our senses soon. I am urging a ceasefire immediately to all the troops engaged in these combats, and use that ceasefire time to promise them a conference of all the leading participants in the next couple of weeks to find a peaceable solution, as was anticipated when the United Nations Charter was drawn up. And the most important quote that I have for you is a quote of my commanding general during the war, commander of all of the Allied forces, later General Dwight D. Eisenhower, later President of the United States. As president, he was leaving, he said, in a very real sense, we can no longer rely on force. If civilization is to survive, it must turn to the rule of law. Those have been my guiding lights. Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the wisdom that he passed on to the rest of the world, and which unfortunately is being disregarded today.
So, we turn to the rule of law, and let's hear Astrid, and where we are with rule of law now.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Thank you to DIIS for organizing this event. And while I, of course, fully share Mr. Ferentz's hopes with regard to the rule of law, there's also no doubt that law is made by men, and men are not perfect, and neither is law, and neither is international criminal law. So what my task today is to give a brief account of the legal definitions of atrocity crimes. First of all, let me highlight that there's no authoritative definition of atrocity crimes, or international crimes as we also call them. But we usually nowadays take as our starting point the crimes under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And these crimes are genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression. Sadly, all of these crimes are already, or may prove to be, relevant in relation to the conflict in Ukraine. I only have 10 minutes at my disposal, but I want to touch briefly on the legal definitions of each of these crimes, with a particular focus on whether the ICC has jurisdiction over the crime, and what it will take to convict perpetrators from the legal perspective, including not least the top leaders such as Vladimir Putin. If we start by looking at the question of jurisdiction, it's crucial that the ICC is a treaty-based court and therefore only has jurisdiction over international crimes committed by citizens of a member state or on the territory of a member state. In other words, it's optional for states to join the court. And if the states haven't joined the court, then the court doesn't, as a starting point, have jurisdiction. It's possible also for the court to get jurisdiction through Security Council referral, but obviously this is not an avenue that's open in the present context, because Russia has the right of veto. So what is the actual basis of the ICC's jurisdiction concerning the ongoing conflict in Ukraine? Russia is, unsurprisingly, not a member state of the ICC, but somewhat surprisingly, neither is Ukraine. Ukraine has not signed on to the Rome Treaty and is not a party to the ICC statute. However, Ukraine has issued declarations following the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Ukraine has issued 2 declarations which give the ICC jurisdiction over crimes committed on Ukrainian territory from 2014 and onwards, thus including the present moment and until further notice, so to speak. So the ICC does have jurisdiction to deal with the crimes committed on Ukrainian territory in connection with the ongoing conflict. But we need to look at each specific crime to see whether the jurisdiction can actually be applied. Since the beginning of the invasion on 24 February, the most obvious crime, and probably the easiest to prove, would seem to be the crime of aggression. Aggression means, and here I quote Article 8 bis of the ICC statute, the planning or execution of the use of armed force by a state against the sovereign territorial integrity or political independence of another state. It seems abundantly clear that Russia has used armed force against the sovereignty and territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine, and that someone like Putin is responsible for these acts. However, due to specific limitations as regards the crime of aggression in Article 15 bis of the ICC statute, the ICC does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression committed by a non-party to the ICC. So this is, I think, a good example of how law created by men is not, or is frequently not ideal. And but the bottom line is the ICC cannot prosecute anyone for aggression, or anyone in Russia for aggression. Let us then turn to the crimes over which the ICC does in fact have jurisdiction, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. As the weeks have gone by, more and more evidence has been revealed that seems to show that it will become relevant for the ICC prosecutor to investigate and issue indictments concerning all of these crimes. First of all, there seems to be ample evidence of war crimes. In the ICC's statutes, Article 8, war crimes are defined in a very elaborate manner, but if just the essence is grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. And an example that we have seemingly witnessed, for example in Bucha, is the failure to distinguish between combatants and civilians who must be protected unless they participate directly in hostilities. Willful killing of civilians is one of the core war crimes, and what we've seen, for example in Bucha, very much looks like willful killing of civilians who were not at the time participating directly in hostilities and had not therefore lost their civilian protection. The events in Bucha may also fall under the second crime under the ICC's jurisdiction, crimes against humanity. In Article 7 of the ICC statute, crimes against humanity, according to Article 7, crimes against humanity encompasses crimes such as murder, extermination, rape, persecution, and all other inhumane acts of a similar character committed, and I quote, as a part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. There are definitely indications that the Russians are conducting a widespread and systematic attack directed at the civilian Ukrainian population, and that we may therefore speak of crimes against humanity. That brings me to the third crime, genocide, which is also commonly known as the crime of crimes. Article 6 in the ICC statute borrows its definition of genocide from the Genocide Convention adopted in 1948, and it defines the crime of genocide as, for example, murder committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Thus, it is not enough to kill members of a specific group. This must be done with genocidal intent, meaning with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the group as such. Genocidal intent is, and we know this from the history of previous international criminal trials, very difficult to prove. But there is a number of examples of Russian rhetoric that indicates a plan to, and here I quote President Joe Biden, to destroy the idea of being Ukrainian. We've seen the US president deliberately change his characterization of events from war crimes to genocide. But it of course remains to be seen whether the ICC prosecutor will indict specific Russians for genocide, and let alone whether it will be possible to actually convict anyone for that crime. Before I end, I want to briefly address the modes of liability relevant for individual Russian soldiers and their military and political leaders. But before I do that, I just want to say that as a lawyer, this ranking of crimes with genocide at the top is somewhat frustrating. The categorization of events as war crimes or genocide says little about the level of human suffering. But at the same time, it's evident that politicians and decision makers do take a great interest in whether we are speaking about genocide compared to war crimes. So back to my final point, what does it take to hold specific individuals criminally responsible for their actions? First of all, Article 25 of the ICC statute gives the court jurisdiction over a person who commits, orders, or solicits war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. Article 25 covers soldiers on the ground and their leaders to the extent that they give orders to commit crimes. In addition, Article 28 of the statute prescribes command responsibility. This means, in short, that a military commander is criminally responsible for crimes within the jurisdiction of the court committed by forces under his or her effective command or control when the military commander knew or should have known that these crimes were taking place and the commander failed to take necessary and reasonable measures to prevent and punish such crimes. The challenges that the ICC prosecutor is currently facing are not just to gather enough evidence that crimes have actually occurred that fall within the ICC's jurisdiction. The prosecutor must also be able to identify specific Russians who are responsible either as direct perpetrators or as commanders. And even if the prosecutor is successful in this endeavor, the indicted individuals must be brought physically to The Hague because the ICC does not prosecute people in absentia. In short, there are numerous legal barriers on the road to a successful ICC trial. And with that, I will hand over to Christian, who will address some of the numerous practical challenges connected with the investigation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Astrid. So we turn to Christian.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone on? Doesn't seem to. Can you hear me? All right, great. All right, what I'm going to talk about is how we go about investigating mass atrocities in Ukraine, and also talk about a couple of the, not just what are the challenges of doing the investigations, but what are the challenges to the post-investigative steps, some of which Astrid has alluded to already in terms of actually apprehending these people, putting them on trial, etc. The investigation of war crimes and atrocities, not just at the local and national levels, but also with competent international authorities, has in fact already commenced in what I would call record time in the case of Ukraine. And as our Ukrainian colleagues remind us, and this is something that Astrid also alluded to, this armed conflict that we're discussing today, and indeed the Commission of Atrocities in Ukraine, is not something that started in February 2022, but in February 2014. And both Ukrainian authorities and the ICC were previously involved in investigating atrocities that had been committed as far back as 2014. So in that sense, we have what I would call a bit of a running start. The fact that everyone is kind of now falling over themselves to contribute to investigations of atrocities in Ukraine is in many ways a good thing, but there's also some bad news. The good news is that the ICC and other investigative organs, both nationally and internationally, are being offered a lot of resources to deal with this issue. The bad news is that we potentially will end up with a lot of cooks in the kitchen kind of tripping over each other, creating overlapping and potentially competing lines of competence and jurisdiction. And just like our colleagues in military analysis would tell us, things get really messy when too many people are trying to do the same thing at the same time. That is definitely true with investigations. My expectation is nonetheless that, as in the case of the former Yugoslavia and to some extent Syria, we will see a combination of national and international investigations and trials in the years to come. National trials and investigations will include processes such as in countries like Germany that have shown enthusiasm for investigating and prosecuting atrocities committed under the umbrella of universal jurisdiction. And we also have some advantages accruing from the fact that, and this is not something a lot of people know, during the past decade or so, the European Union and the United States, Canada have poured a tremendous amount of resources into training Ukrainian investigators to combat organized crime and corruption. And from my own experience investigating atrocities, a lot of the competencies and skills that you need to investigate organized crime and corruption can also be usefully put in place for the complex investigations of atrocities. Now, moving to the practical side, based on my own experience, the most important point I can make about investigating atrocities is one made by my former boss, Patrick Traynor, of the leadership research team at the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Patrick said, saying that we all know that an atrocity was committed, or that we all know that it is common knowledge that Milosevic, Assad, or Putin committed certain crimes is the biggest mistake we can make in investigations. Conventional wisdom or assumed common knowledge is not evidence and is completely useless in the courtroom. I'm now going to make some points based on my own practical experience, and I've worked, besides the ICTY, I've also worked in investigations for the ICC and also at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon and other courts. Let me just briefly stress that in making these points, I'm not in any way standing up here purporting to state that these lessons are unknown to any of my competent and dedicated colleagues, some of whom are already working on Ukraine as we speak here today, but I want to try to give you a portrait of some of the challenges that we're facing. Atrocity investigations, briefly put, are all about connecting the evidence surrounding the immediate crimes, what we call the crime base in ICC parlance, that is the forensic evidence, the actual crime site, as we know from police procedurals and other kinds of detective stories and so on. So that's the crime base, and then connecting that to those who are responsible, and in the case of atrocities, those who are most responsible, and I want to stress the word most responsible, are often located at great distance, both figuratively and geographically, from the places where these crimes are being committed. International criminal investigations therefore rely on structural linkage, or leadership analysis as we call it, in order to prove the commission of crimes. And let us remember, as Astrid also cited from the statute, that there are many different modalities of committing crimes. So not only do we have crimes of commission, but we also have crimes of commission by omission. For example, if we can prove that a defense minister or a general was aware of systematic shelling of civilian settlements, but did nothing to intervene to stop that or to investigate or prosecute those responsible. And incidentally, the reason we put this up here is because a lot of what I'm talking about here is available for free at the Swedish Defense Academy in this handbook that I wrote on in assisting international criminal investigations. Now, what we're seeing also is that we need to look at how these modalities actually work out in practice, and then we need to prosecute these crimes, and we do so by rebuilding structures. Essentially, we have to understand, how does a defense ministry operate? What units are there? What are the chains of command? What are the logistical chains? What evidence do we have that they actually knew what was going on in a specific location? And I want to just stress very briefly that does not, a good analyst and a good investigator is not out there looking for smoking guns. A lot of what we're doing is building also structural portraits. In other words, I can just briefly mention a case we had at the Yugoslav tribunal where the judges specifically said, well, we didn't actually see any evidence that there were reports being delivered to the Minister of Atrocities, but guess what we saw? We saw all kinds of other information, completely banal information about license plates and burglaries being delivered to the minister, and if he knew all of that, then it tells us something that he was not being informed about those atrocities. That was considered acceptable behavior. So what we do is document-driven analysis, which requires creating thorough document collection plans that are neither too broad nor too narrow. This means ensuring that international and national partners share their potential evidence with investigative teams, which has not always been the case in the past. Here, the information age in which we live today has also, again, goods and bad sides. We're already being deluged on, just open Twitter with information, some of it potentially useful as evidence, on open sources, on social media, and also being collected by dedicated organizations such as Bellingcat, as well as the more traditional human rights organizations. We're also seeing large-scale disclosures, very interestingly, from various ministries of classified documentation through hacker collectives such as Anonymous, though the admissibility of such information as evidence will need to be adjudicated at the ICC. Open sources, however great they are, and they are a boon to investigations, are not a magic bullet, however, and they need to be accompanied by the often humdrum but necessary work of document-driven leadership analysis based on a combination of open and confidential sources. In other words, somebody needs to sit down and tell me how, for example, the defense ministry works, or what are the rules when the Air Force and the Army conduct joint operations, who has command responsibility. These are the types of things we're looking at. We're also looking at proving patterns. While war crimes can be committed discreetly, and sometimes are in fact prosecuted discreetly, though rarely, we are usually interested in patterns, as Astrid said, widespread and systematic patterns, especially the kinds we need to prove crimes against humanity and genocide. A good example of this would be investigating, for example, the many allegations we've seen regarding systematic deportations of Ukrainian civilians to Russia. That would be one thing that would require a lot of systematic analysis. Another potentially interesting aspect is the fact that compared to previous conflicts, when I look at Ukraine, we actually have a lot less of an issue with what we call plausible deniability. I mean, it's obvious to everyone, whether we call this a special military operation or a war, it's pretty obvious what's going on. And of course, compared to the Ukraine conflict from 2014 to 2022, we have far less use of paramilitary units in committing alleged atrocities since February than we might otherwise expect from places like Syria and the former Yugoslavia. This will likely come in handy and save investigative teams some time, and paradoxically, open source admissions about Russian troop involvement in terms of casualty notices and obituaries that are being published on Russian social media might help clarify certain issues. But of course, we also see a predictable pattern of denial of crimes and an attempt to portray atrocities as being staged by the other side. This is again a well-known phenomenon that my colleagues who worked on atrocities in the Balkans are familiar with, and we have templates for dealing with these investigative challenges. We also need to understand the relevant recent historical and political context. To be clear, it is not the job of the ICC or any other prosecuting agency to write a history of the conflict in Ukraine, though that might well be in part a byproduct, as we've seen in Yugoslavia. That having been said, these conflicts and atrocities, and here I betray my identity as a historian, have proximate historical roots, and the use and abuse of history figures prominently in official Russian justifications for the invasion of Ukraine. Statements denying Ukrainian nationhood, statehood, dehumanizing Ukrainians, etc., are clearly relevant in explaining and understanding the mens rea of perpetrators of mass atrocities in Ukraine. And in this context, I would note that it is particularly interesting that we already have a large and in many cases astoundingly explicit set of statements by senior Russian officials, at least again compared to many previous cases of mass atrocities such as in the former Yugoslavia. Profiling key actors and indeed advisors to key decision makers and understanding the ideological justifications for the war is part and parcel of investigating especially crimes against humanity and genocide. As in any modern armed conflict or conflict of mass or situation of mass atrocities, the number of incidents and perpetrators is already huge. A recent count by the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office already listed over 6,000 separate alleged incidents of war crimes. And that's rising by the day. So we need to recognize, and this is just a reality check for all of us, that we must focus on investigating and prosecuting those most responsible. We will never, ever prosecute and investigate more than a very small portion of those atrocities that are being committed in this or any other conflict. So we need to choose very wisely in investigating and prosecuting. And one of the ways we can do that is by focusing on the most responsible. And in fact, as we did at the ICTY and in other cases, we need to basically convert, as we do in organized crime investigations, mid-level perpetrators, insiders, some of whom may defect to, for example, Denmark or other countries, and who are willing to provide us with the inside evidence of how crimes were committed. Building cases against those most responsible by first investigating and prosecuting mid-level cases, and then, and only then, moving up to the most responsible is very important. Likewise, I would say that we need to avoid front-loading the investigations with a specific target or change. The big one, again, one of the biggest mistakes you can commit in international criminal investigations, or I would argue in investigations in general, is to start with a target and then investigate around that target. You have to have evidence-driven investigations. And we use a document which is also freely available, the Elements of Crimes. You can look it up by the ICC. It's a corollary to the statute where actually it's a kind of a recipe book for what each crime entails. So if you're of the devious mindset, you can see how you can commit these crimes. If you're of the investigative mindset, how to prevent these crimes and how to prosecute them. But the point here is that you need to start looking at what the evidence actually tells you, and please do not start with genocide. Please do not start with a specific crime and then try to investigate towards that crime, because you're going to be making a lot of mistakes. And this leads to my next to last point, which is managing public expectations. Not necessarily something you would think of in terms of investigations, but hugely important, as we've seen from the Rwandan, Yugoslav, and other tribunals, not least in terms of managing expectations among the victim communities. This involves everything from dealing with what I could call the Wimbledon or Premier League effect, for those of you pick your sport that you prefer, where we have a lot of people who've never done these things that are sitting on the sideline and saying, why don't they do it and why haven't they already indicted someone? We need to let these people, they're not immune to constructive criticism, but we shouldn't be standing on the sidelines, those of us who haven't done it, and pretending that we could do it better than they are, because it's a very, very difficult thing. And especially if we go around saying that genocide was committed, go around saying that certain other crimes were committed, we're essentially front-loading a lot of problems that are going to pop up later, and that will create, again, a lot of disappointment and basically lost expectations among the victim community. So to end, we need to be in this for the long haul. We're here, depending on what we're looking for, 8 years and 2 months, or 2 months after this war begun. I, again, subscribe to the 8 years and 2 months. No one knows how long the war will last, but even if it ends soon, it will be years, not months, before indictments are brought. Indeed, this might happen after the war ends, and particularly given the prospect of high-ranking Russian officials being indicted, this means that there will need to be a strong stamina and international consensus. Here it is based on the example of the ICTY, difficult for me to be optimistic at all. Let me remind you that in the case of Mladic and Karadzic, it was by the mid-2000s extremely difficult to find, even in the European Union, anyone who was willing to maintain pressure on Serbia, which was harboring both fugitives, to cooperate with the ICTY. Many countries in the EU were much more interested in reopening trade and normalizing ties to Serbia at that point. Now imagine, and I'm thinking here today about also the news that you've all heard about Russian gas supplies being cut to Bulgaria and Poland. Now imagine 5 years after the war, indictments are out there, we're waiting for trials to start, but everybody wants to trade with Russia again, right? So we need to also think ahead to that post-conflict time. Finally, let me make a necessary point which will be very controversial to some of you, but really should never be controversial to anyone when we talk about these issues. We're bound to see atrocities committed on both sides of this war. Let me repeat that. Atrocities will be committed by both sides in this war, as is in the case of every modern conflict. To recognize this is not to practice false equivalencies or to negate or marginalize the clear fact that we are dealing with one state's invasion of a neighboring state, but we do justice, ironically, one could say, we do justice to the field of international criminal justice by investigating and prosecuting both sides of the conflict. We prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity, not because the victims are Ukrainians or Russians, but because they're human.
Thank you so much, Christian. This was really a tour de force, sweeping, going through in investigating these kind of crimes, and also based on your experience, it's very obvious that you have been working with this for many, many years. It was kind of pessimistic how you ended your talk, but still you maintain your belief in what you do.
Realistic.
And realistic, yes. So we move a bit. How can we say that, Robin? We move a bit, a step further into the actual crimes, no?
Okay. Yes.
And one of the things that have been described in international media is rape taking place in Ukraine these days, and this is also Robin's subject, sexualized violence. Please.
Thank you. Is this working? My microphone. Okay. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, there have been many stories of brutal violence against civilians. At the end of March, the first stories began to emerge about sexual violence against women. For example, in a BBC report, a woman reported living in a rural village west of Kyiv that she was raped, her husband was murdered, that in fact she was saved by another unit of Russians who came in and got rid of the rapists, but occupied her house, and she said, you know, they were high the whole time. When they left, she found drugs and Viagra. In Bucha, 25 girls and women were systematically raped during the occupation in the basement of one house, and 9 of them are now pregnant. It's reported that Russian soldiers told them they would rape them to the point where they wouldn't want sexual contact with any man to prevent them from having Ukrainian children, apropos the discussion of genocide, which we can return to. Unfortunately, researchers who know the field of sexual violence have been worrying and expecting that such revelations might occur. A recent PRIO report notes that Russian militaries committed sexual violence already during the annexation of Crimea. Christian was talking about crimes back in 2014, and then in the war in Chechnya. Human rights groups have also reported that sexual violence has been prevalent in the Donbas region. Many young Russians have been forcibly recruited into the war, and this is actually one of the most robust indicators of the incidence of sexual violence in wartime. In 2015, Russia established the so-called Yurnamia, a youth army of thousands of soldiers that has pressured orphans and vulnerable people to enlist. And anecdotal information coming out of Ukraine is that many of the soldiers who have been captured have been such young, vulnerable soldiers. When this happens through forced recruitments, this is a phenomenon we know both in combat and also in gang and prison gangs, that forcible recruitment is an indicator of high use of sexual violence. Such organizations lack internal cohesion, and this is a way of quickly breaking bonds with the norms in the community from which one comes and creating, cementing loyalty to the group, a phenomenon that Dara K. Cohen calls combat socialization. Those who enact state violence often employ rape rhetoric in general, and 2 weeks before ordering the invasion of Ukraine, Putin was reported to make a joke about marital rape from a Soviet-era punk song saying, "Like it or don't like it, it's your duty, my beauty," when he spoke about compelling President Zelensky to comply with the Minsk agreements. In 2006, when referring to rape charges pending against Israel's then-president Moshe Katsav, Putin said, well, he was envious of Katsav. He didn't think he looked like a guy who could be with 10 women. Putin has been known to put down women for menstruating, as has Donald Trump, and he has boasted that his country's prostitutes are the best in the world. In 2017, he decriminalized domestic violence, the same year in which Ukraine, which has a very high rate of domestic violence, criminalized it. Of course, there's historical background. Just to mention briefly, we know it's commonly thought that sexual violence in war is part of the booty of war. We can go back to 8th century BC, the depiction of the rape of the Sabine women, where the first Roman men kidnapped and raped the neighboring women in order to produce offspring. In the 20th century, we have examples of the rape of Nanking in the winter of 1937 to 38. World War II, in which American, German, Russian soldiers all committed rape. Bangladesh, Vietnam War, where both American and South Vietnamese soldiers were widely known to rape. Peru, Guatemala, El Salvador in the 80s, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda in the 1990s. So there has been overwhelming examples of this historical phenomenon. And in fact, in the Akayesu case from the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, it was found that rape can, in some cases, constitute genocide. However, one should be wary of saying this means that rape is always inevitable and will happen at all time, because this is not factually correct. Rape is not collateral damage, it doesn't happen by accident, and it can be widespread and systematic. But it is not inevitable, and there are cases in which it has not occurred. The Tamil secessionist group, the LTTE, in the Sri Lankan conflict, insurgents in the civil war in El Salvador in the 1980s, Israel-Palestinian conflict, Iraq, Afghanistan. These are all cases of conflict in which sexual violence was absent. And therefore, recent research focuses on the need to look at variations and the uneven patterns of sexual violence in order to understand it. And sometimes, as we have in this initial example from Bucha, there can be different units within the same army that have different practices. I just want to run quickly through some of the by now well-known explanations. I would say that research in the field of sexual violence, while this is not news, it has certainly grown since the 1970s. Susan Brown Miller's important work on rape from the 1990s with the work of journalists and the international courts on former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And so there's been this attempt to understand why. How can we understand this? Why in war, during brutal violence against civilians, is there sexualized violence? Isn't there some simple answer or explanation? And so many of people have tried with different explanations. I'm just going to give you some of examples. Some people say, well, it must be because of militarized masculinities. Or maybe it's because there's opportunity. And when given the opportunity, on the assumption that all men are potential rapists, then men will rape. Or could it be because it's a substitute for sex? You can't have a prostitute, you can't have your girlfriend, you can't have a female competent, so you rape. Or is it because of patriarchal culture? Or is it because of a continuum thesis? If there's sexual violence in a society prior to conflict, there will be sexual violence committed by those combatants. These are all examples that have been developed over the last decades to give a monocausal explanation of sexual violence. And the most important aspect, I will say, about this last example of the continuum thesis is that it shows, we don't have a continuum showing what happens prior to conflict occurs in conflict, but there is a continuum showing that what happens in conflict can affect the post-conflict situation. Many people who are victims, male or female victims of political violence or sexual violence in conflict will often experience intimate partner violence post-conflict. But recently, there's been a turn away from this monocausal explanation to look more specifically at the organization. This could be the armed organization, this could be gangs, and it shows that there both have to be an analysis of top-down dynamics and bottom-up dynamics. Top-down dynamics can be when sexual violence is used strategically in pursuit of the organization's objectives, as when, for example, it institutionalized sexual slavery or forced marriage, as in the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, or in Islamic State in 2014 with the abduction of Yazidi men, women, and children who were subjected to rape, sexual violence, and forced marriage. But in addition to this top-down dynamic, we have to understand, as we've already heard, it's not always ordered, but it may be tolerated. And in fact, we should understand sexual violence in conflict as a practice that emerges because of other dynamics. For example, because of this forced recruitment as a way of building group norms and breaking ties with the community, both through the initiation rituals and through the impact of violence in conflict on small groups. So to the final question that Cecilia noted is perhaps too optimistic, is there something that can be done to prevent sexualized violence in war when we know it doesn't always occur? Elizabeth Wood, professor in political science at Yale, has done some excellent work, and here there are some of the suggestions she mentions. One can and should hold commanders accountable. And Christian was talking about what is it, the importance of looking at mid-level leaders. Accountability refers both to military and political leadership. One can and should strengthen institutions for the socialization of soldiers so that they understand that it's not only because sexual violence should be prohibited, but that it should not take place. One should adopt gender-neutral definition of rape so it's not merely viewed as a women's issue. One should document, again, documentation, in specifics, the pattern of violence, because you can't have a policy to address sexual torture of men with proposals about forced abortion. One can and should learn from peacetime policies about marketing campaigns to change social norms, from successes and failures of previous initiatives, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda on the UN level, the International Criminal Courts. One should be aware of the high risk for sexual violence in some contexts, such as forcible recruitment, torture, the separation of men and women detainees during ethnic violence, the inadequate provision of troops. One should combat the stigmatization of victims in their community. And in fact, this is something female Ukrainian lawyers are working on at this moment, arguing that we need to rob sexual violence from the stigma it inflicts on victims and transform it so it is properly directed to perpetrators instead. Changing the symbolic meaning of rape is transformational. One can and should prosecute mid-level and low-level commanders who either order or tolerate rape, and we've talked about some of the legal channels for doing this. There are also scholars who argue that we need to have a new crime, a category of crime introduced, addressing enforced impregnation, as enforced impregnation can be viewed as genocidal both in terms of women, as in the Bucha example, who may never want to have sex again and therefore not have their children, or against children who become excluded from their community. So finally, if military and political leadership continue to allow sexual violence to occur with impunity, they confirm the false and tragic view that sexualized violence in war is natural and inevitable. They should be held accountable. Thank you.
you so much, Robin. It's actually difficult to say to comment on what you said, because it's so moving and yeah, on this kind of very touchy subject. So we move to Johannes and go a step deeper. The psychological mechanisms behind atrocities. What is at stake here? So, yeah.
Thanks. I will talk about some of the psychological mechanisms, at least behind these kinds of atrocities. When I first heard about Bucha, I immediately thought about My Lai. There just seemed to be so many similarities to me that kind of jumped out from the descriptions of what was happening in Bucha. In 1968, during the Vietnam War, a company of American soldiers, Charlie Company, killed hundreds, up to 500 civilians in the village of My Lai. When those American soldiers had arrived in Vietnam a few months earlier, they had been friendly towards the civilians. They had been handing out candy to the children, trying to befriend the local population. But the next few months would change the soldiers. 2 months before the massacre, the North Vietnamese had launched the Tet Offensive, the largest counterattack of the war, which exposed the lie that the US administration was telling the American public, which was that they were winning the war. Here now they were faced with surprising and demoralizing resistance from the enemy. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, the American soldiers met fierce resistance, the soldiers in this company, Charlie Company, and they suffered heavy casualties. But the enemy remained elusive, deploying guerrilla tactics, striking at the American forces, and then disappearing, melting back into the jungle, often hiding among the civilians. So, in the weeks and months leading up to the massacre, the American soldiers were getting angry, frustrated, frightened, and emotions were running high. And on March 16th, 1968, they were ordered to attack My Lai. This was a Viet Cong stronghold, they were told, and they should go in firing their guns. But they met no resistance. Once again, the enemy had slipped away, if it had ever been there to begin with. But by then, in a way, it was too late. The situation had momentum of its own. The adrenaline was pumping. The training kicked in, as some of the soldiers later said. They went in expecting a firefight. There was none. But already the massacre was underway, and they ended up shooting at everyone and anyone they could find, and utterly destroying the village. When I read accounts from Bucha in the New York Times in the days after the story came to light, I was reminded of My Lai. In the weeks leading up to the atrocities in Bucha, the fighting had been intense. There are accounts by witnesses in Bucha saying that when the Russian soldiers first arrived, they were relatively peaceful, many of them. But the fighting intensified, and the Ukrainians have also adopted a kind of guerrilla tactics, fighting in small groups, attacking behind the Russian lines, and disappearing again, perhaps hiding among the population sometimes. The weapons the Ukrainians have received from allies have turned out to be devastatingly effective, and the Russians have suffered heavy casualties. And in Bucha, as they were withdrawing from Kyiv, they were in danger of being surrounded and having to fight their way out. As with the Americans in My Lai, it is easy to imagine that many of the Russian soldiers in Bucha were angry, frustrated, and frightened, and that they lashed out. Or at least this is one possible part of the explanation. In both My Lai and Bucha, the atrocities took place within a larger war that had by then abandoned the distinction between soldiers and civilians in any meaningful sense. In North Vietnam, body counts had become an important measure of the success of a given mission, regardless of whether the bodies were soldiers or civilians. The US bombed villages and towns, because the Americans were frustrated with their failure to subdue the North Vietnamese and hoped to demoralize them by bombing them. In the Ukraine, the Russian military is bombing civilian targets and leveling whole villages, towns, and even cities to the ground in an attempt to bomb the Ukrainian people into submission. The message in both cases is clear. Civilians are legitimate targets. The message is also that the soldiers will never be held to account for the war crimes they commit. In Chechnya, Russian forces killed tens of thousands of civilians in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they also completely destroyed cities. Yet virtually none of the perpetrators of these war crimes have ever been persecuted or prosecuted in Russia. After My Lai, only one lieutenant was convicted of these crimes, and he was later released from prison after President Nixon intervened in his case. In both My Lai and the Ukraine, soldiers allowed themselves to be photographed while perpetrating war crimes. Some of the Russian soldiers even post their atrocities on social media. They are proud and they are shameless, and this reflects a sense of impunity as well as a culture of violence. The Russian military is a very violent place to be. Officers and other soldiers often beat and humiliate more junior soldiers. Over the years, of the past years, thousands of recruits have run away from the military. Not a few have been killed by officers or have committed suicide, leaving notes saying stuff like, "My life has turned into a hell." So there's a brutalization of the soldiers in the Russian military. And you need to show strength and brutality to gain respect in that hierarchy. There's also this kind of lack of the non-commissioned officer corps in between the higher up commanders of the military and the low-ranking soldiers. So there's this kind of disconnect also between the top and the bottom in the Russian military that has some consequences that we can go more into if we want to. And this kind of these brutal practices reflect a worldview that is shared by many in the Russian military, which is that you either dominate or you get dominated. You either victimize or you become the victim. And while the American soldiers in Vietnam had been through basic training that was specifically targeting and emphasizing the ability to kill and to overcome any kind of inhibitions to killing. So, in conclusion, just to sum up, these are some of the key social and psychological similarities that I immediately saw between My Lai and Bucha. Brutalization, a brutal war, a larger context of violence against civilians, but also brutalization in the military, within the military, cultural violence, and a sense of impunity, which has been mentioned in the earlier talks. How do we challenge that sense of impunity? Because that is really key here to the psychology of the perpetrators, is this sense that they know that they are going to get away with it. So if the international community can give any sense, any realistic sense that there is a chance that you might one day have to face the consequences of what you're doing, I think that is something to hope for. Because so far, the Russian and American soldiers who perpetrated those atrocities were right in, they have been, when we look back, they were correct to assume that they could act with impunity. So, thank you.
Sense of impunity, that not to be held accounted for, and we started out with Ferenc saying that the rule of law must kind of step in instead of violence, and in a way, how you ended your talk, Johannes, I don't see much hope in a way. And also based on what Christian said, that it will take years to, first the war will have to end, and then it will take really many years to have this prosecuted and investigated and prosecuted. So why the effort? And why I posed the first question, I also invite you to raise your hand, and I see also Astrid.
Should I turn this on again?
Maybe if this mic works better, because it's still a little, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think, going back to the rule of law, actually conducting these trials in a manner that lives up to the rule of law, where we need to provide sufficient evidence. The perpetrator has a right to a defense. The perpetrator has a right to be present in the courtroom, and so on. I think if we're not going to do this properly, I don't think we're not adhering to the rule of law. And you may ask, why do it at all? So I think the fact that it will take time, sure, it's frustrating, but I would argue that in the long haul, that's actually worthwhile. And I think chances are we will see Russians in The Hague. Remains to be seen at what level indictments will be made and prosecutions will be successful in terms of actually convicting anyone. But I think it's important to be patient in these matters, because if we're going to have international criminal law, we need to live up to the criminal law standards that we apply in domestic settings. Otherwise, this, I think in the long term, it's really not going to do what it's supposed to do.
And Christian?
Yeah, I was going to say, I had a little kind of a brainwave here. Johannes was going back to 1968. I'm going to go in the future, which is very against what I do as a historian. But based on what I've seen connecting Ukraine and the former Yugoslavia, consider this, it's 2035, we're sitting here talking about atrocities, and the ICC is currently in 2035, which is, by the way, a very realistic time frame, prosecuting a Russian minister for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and also, in a separate case, also at the ICC, prosecuting a high-ranking Ukrainian officer whose unit allegedly massacred a large civilian population when Ukraine finally managed to liberate certain portions of its territory. Now, in both countries, I predict, Ukraine and Russia, they will be outraged that these people are being prosecuted. The Ukrainians will be outraged because how can you prosecute people who were defending themselves? And the Russians will be outraged because, well, we never committed any crimes in the first place. They're still in a state of denial. This example I've just given you is not an abstract example. It in fact exists in Croatia and Serbia, because this is precisely what 30 years after the wars of Yugoslav succession, this is how this is being treated. And when I say that I'm not pessimistic but realistic, I'm not just being annoying, I think I'm being accurate, because one of the things that has shocked me, and again I would just like you to consider the implications of this for Ukraine and for atrocities in Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, of the current phase of the war, in February 2022, a Serbian talk show Serbia is a candidate to become a member of the EU. A Serbian talk show had a military expert in their studio to discuss how Russia could successfully impose a siege on Kyiv. That expert, ladies and gentlemen, was Veselin Shlivanchanin, who was convicted at the ICTY for crimes against humanity and war crimes in Vukovar. That is their expert in the studio, and I could give you another example of a high-ranking Serbian officer who now teaches again at the military academy in Belgrade. So that's where I still think we need to do this. I think we need to keep pushing, but I'm very pessimistic about the long-term effects of this.
Of course, this is a central question.
You need to mute your own microphone. No.
It's not on. Okay.
Somebody's. So you mute that.
Am I on now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Of course, this is a central question and one which we've been grappling with for decades. And we in the midst of this really, I think, have the sense that this is an epical event and we're rewriting our understanding of security, of Europe, of the EU role, of the global world order. But I think it's important to understand, however crucial rule of law is, and courts affirming rule of law, there are different spheres of justice. And this is something we've talked a lot about post-Holocaust genocide. It would be wrong to think that the only way one can address a sense of justice, a need of justice, is through the courts, though those are crucial and they're slow, and we need to acknowledge that. But in testimony, art, understandings in philosophy, history, ethics, these may have a different temporality, a different speed, and I am sure we will see a lot of activities around this also in terms of activism. And this is one way of addressing a sense of justice. And I think in this context, it's very important that we remind ourselves of some of the pitfalls in these debates where one easily turns against sort of suffering, turns against victims, because that's awfully painful. And shouldn't we just move ahead to the future and forget about this past? This was a theme that Jean-Marie discussed, Auschwitz survivor. So the importance of maintaining a solid grounding in the atrocities and the crisis, and what does it mean in the whole spectrum of human cultural activities to seek justice.
I have nothing to add to that. No.
My name is Christina Grigoraki. I'm from the University of Copenhagen, Department of Political Science. So I come more from an IR perspective, and I'm hearing everything about, and I know the faults of the ICC and how difficult it is to prosecute war crimes and all that. And I'm also thinking about the tools that we're currently using as an international community to isolate Russia and this broader sense of accountability and how we get to that. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, because it seems like that's already a struggle already now, because it is very difficult to isolate Russia. Like even Canada came out and said, we can't exclude them from the G20. We need them internationally, both in trade and in other parts, because of how our world works right now. So in that broader sense of accountability, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Shall we take another one? One of your mics is on. If you please make sure you are muted, everybody. So I have down here, yes, please. Det kan du godt, og så skal vi oversætte spørgsmål. Yes. Yeah. To ask if he could ask a question in Danish, and then we will translate. Yeah, please.
Og jeg har mest spørgsmål til Astrid og Christian, men også nogle til hele panelet. Og jeg ved godt, vi er 20 minutter eller 25 minutter dagsordenen. Men jeg håber alligevel, der bliver tid til det. Når man skulle præsentere sig, jeg hedder Tue Magnussen og er i dag pensionist, men har tidligere arbejdet i forskellige sammenhænge for menneskerettigheder, blandt andet også især som koordinator på det danske Center for Rehabilitering af Torturoffer. Vil du oversætte?
Tue Magnussen is now retired, but he has for many years worked with human rights and also worked for the Danish Center for, how do you translate, torture dignity. Yeah. And he's a well-known figure in this context. So please, Tue, if you...
Ja. I dag er der jo en skarp kritik af menneskerettighederne og fra Biden mod Putin. Og det er jo lidt underligt, når man samtidig er i en situation, hvor USA ikke anerkender ICC. Så det fører mig til det spørgsmål, om det er sådan, at paneldeltagerne vil opfordre USA til at revurdere sin holdning til ICC, og måske også lægge pres på de partnere, som USA nu har, herunder den danske regering, for at de også skal prøve at få USA til faktisk ikke kun at retsforfølge krigsforbrydelser i Ukraine og i Rusland, men også i, om jeg så må sige, deres egen baghave, for eksempel på spørgsmål om Guantanamo.
Skal jeg se, om jeg kan oversætte det spørgsmål. Fik du det, Christian? Ja, så du oversætter. Yes, please. The question regards
the question regards the ICC and in particular the US, which has been opposed to the ICC, and whether the US's enthusiasm for the ICC's involvement with respect to, for example, Ukraine, will cause Biden and others in the US to reconsider their skepticism and or hostility to the ICC, and whether there will also be increased pressure, perhaps also in Denmark and in other countries, for the ICC to look at atrocities or alleged atrocities committed by the US itself and others. I'm going to tie this very briefly together with the other question, and then Astrid, maybe you can look at it from a legal perspective. From a historical perspective, I would say there's the optimistic view. The optimistic view is that by using the ICC, even if it does so opportunistically, instrumentally, and some might well say hypocritically, then the US implicitly recognizes that the ICC is legitimate. And by making it legitimate, US hypocrisy on atrocities becomes even more visible and, one might say, untenable. And in that sense, we could, if we're optimistic, then in the medium to long term, the chances increase that the US will become more engaged with international criminal law as a whole and not just opportunistically. As you may have guessed, I'm not an optimist. So let me just briefly say that, first of all, this is not the first time that the US has participated very enthusiastically with the ICC. They did so over Darfur, and it didn't really change the fundamental US stance. The Obama administration showed no appetite for joining the ICC. Biden administration is not much more enthusiastic, and without getting too deep into the morass of American politics, I'm not particularly optimistic about the US after November of this year, when it looks likely that we'll have a Republican-controlled Congress again, and that means that the ICC will be promoted once again to the level of the Antichrist. So in that sense, I think I'm still of the mind frame that I would rather have the US helping the ICC sometimes than never, but I'm not optimistic that we'll ever see the US, or for that matter, Russia, China, India, Brazil, and many other countries join in the party.
Må jeg ikke lige sige, at det var jo et spørgsmål til hele panelet, og bagefter kommer der mere specifikt til Christian og Astrid, så det var måske en god idé at
det will come over. Two says that it was a question to all members of panel, but I mean we start with Christian. Astrid, and then see if both Johannes and Robbie want to answer. They are not obliged to, and then you have a final question afterwards to Christian. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think the hypocrisy on the part of the U.S. is quite obvious. If I can just add to what Christian said. So there's been a lot of skepticism, not just from the US, but from numerous countries around the world about the ICC. And this might actually be a golden opportunity for the ICC to prove its legitimacy. And much rides on how these investigations go and what the prosecutor, who's fairly newly appointed, ends up, how it ends up going with all of this. Because if the ICC is successful, in this situation, the ICC is basically the only international court that can actually do something. We've already seen a case before the International Court of Justice based on the Genocide Convention. The court did issue provisional measures, but Russia is not doing anything. So the ICC is a court that might actually, to some extent, albeit perhaps limited, end up being effective in dealing with this situation. And so if the ICC does well, and if we're optimistic, then perhaps it will increase the legitimacy of the ICC, and chances that more states will end up joining may be fair. But we'll see.
I think some others.
Okay, just to follow up on Christian's comments, I mean, I don't have that much to add, but I think it's interesting to think about how one uses the hypocrisy argument. Does using the hypocrisy argument disqualify a critical position on the part of the United States or not? This has been a big debate since the start of the war, and I think one should be very wary of using the hypocrisy argument for that. Yes, the U.S. has been an imperialist, aggressive country and should be rightly criticized in many occasions. That does not disqualify the critique in this context. So we have to keep the broad picture and the historical critical perspective.
Yeah. So you had one more question, and then I have yes.
Jeg undskylder, hvis jeg tager for meget tid, men jeg har nogle specifikke spørgsmål, dels til Astrid og dels til Christian. I artiklen fra 21, Astrid, skriver du i artiklen om, hvornår Danmark er ansvarlig for partners krænkelser af folkeretten. Og der undrer mig lidt, at du egentlig ikke omtaler for eksempel Gillon-sagen, altså den israelske ambassadør, som vedstod, at han havde brugt tortur, og så spørgsmål om Danmarks eventuelle retsforfølgelse af, om man må kalde Israel en partner. Det gør i hvert fald den danske regering selv. Det andet spørgsmål, det er, at i samme artikel omtaler du våbentraktaters betydning. Men du siger ikke noget om FN's traktat om forbud mod atomvåben, men nævner andre traktater og konventioner mod brug af specifikke våben.
Jeg synes, at det vil være fair, at du stiller spørgsmål til det, der er blevet sagt i dag. Så måske, eller hvis...
Why don't we discuss these issues after the seminar?
Yes, it's okay for me. But then I'll just, the final one for Christian, that is this question whether you regard the bombardment of NATO towards targets in Belgrade as a war crime, and what is the consequences of that. I know that there have been a decision made by at the international level, but there are still people who is trying to make NATO and US responsible for those cases.
Well, I would like to perhaps remind the two that we're here to discuss atrocities in Ukraine. And I think that with all due respect, and I'm happy to discuss allegations of NATO atrocities with you on a separate occasion, I think the general gist of your questions is floating very clearly over into a tendency of what I would call whataboutism. So on that note, I would like to hear some other questions that actually have to deal with the topic that is before us today.
Thank you. So, and then I have... Sorry? Thank you. Yeah. So Robin, and then I have Henrik, and after
I'll
the
say
70s.
something just to show we haven't forgotten your question, but not that I have an answer. I mean, this is, of course, a crucial question. What happens when a country becomes a pariah country, when it becomes excluded from a world order? I think both on micro and macro levels, one understands that if one's pushed out of some kind of standards of political, social norms, it is the tendency to extremism accelerates. And I know there's been discussions about the consequences of this for Russian citizens now with economic sanctions and what this means on an everyday level for them now, 3 months from now, 3 years from now. These are very serious issues. But I don't know what the response is. I'm sure one could distinguish between normative, political, and security issues. Personally, when I hear the argument that Putin has to be able to come out saving face, I think, feminist, critic of patriarchy, why should he be able to save face? That's one level. That's my moral outrage. When one reads about how Russia as a autocracy has developed, and one now begins to talk of vertical lines of leadership, not even pyramid, because they're so narrow, and that explains the lack of good information and input to him. What does that mean about possibilities of accountability? So I think the only thing we can do is to try to look at as many dimensions of this issue as possible and navigate it in our different spheres.
And then we have a question from Henrik.
Henrik Døgert, journalist. I think it's a question for Christian. Since the Criminal Court for ex-Yugoslavia concluded its work, has there been any examples of judgment in Serbia or in Bosnia-Herzegovina against people responsible for atrocities in the wars in the 90s, genocide, etc.?
Yes, just briefly, there have been courts, national courts in Croatia, Serbia, Kosovo, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, I believe in Montenegro as well, which have had investigations and successful prosecutions of perpetrators. But again, very briefly, they've generally tended to ignore the most responsible and just focus directly on immediate perpetrators. I do, but not in my pocket right now.
Okay, so we have one final question down there, unless anybody, yes, please, and if you could introduce
My name
us.
is C.A. Schrøder. I am a security politics journalist at Monday Morning, and my question is sort of on the line of the reports we get from Ukraine right now that the Wagner Group and other mercenaries are at place. Is the ICC equipped to maybe carry out any form of juridisk efterspil? Yes, afterwards.
Yes.
Okay, that's a short answer, but could you elaborate
I would
a little
note
bit?
specifically with the Wagner Group, because it links to that group's alleged involvement in atrocities in the Central African Republic, in Mali, and elsewhere, that the ICC was, to my knowledge, already looking at the involvement of the Wagner Group in atrocities in other geographical situations.
Astrid, do you want to add something from your perspective? Same. Okay, so I just want to ask a final question that actually goes to Johannes, since I think you also should have a chance to, how do you say that, elaborate a little bit on your presentation. Because Robin, by the end of her talk, she mentioned several kind of measures, strengthen institutions, adopt gender-neutral definition of rape, learn from peacetime, and so on. You know, this list of recommendation coming from Robin, what to do to prevent, and that was actually Robin's attempt to kind of answer this difficult question, how to prevent. And if I turn to your presentation and you say brutalization, culture of violence, and then the very important thing as I hear you, sense of impunity. Are there any of these measures that Robin mentioned that would actually help or kind of prevent or work against these three features that you mentioned, namely brutalization, culture of violence, and sense of impunity?
Yeah, I think Robin also mentioned some examples where there what's wrong with this one? Okay, so she mentioned some examples where there haven't been, you know, cases of sexual violence, or less cases, like much less. And that often has to do with the commanders and the fact that they are sending clear signals that this is, you know, not to be tolerated. There might be taboos in the military culture that this is not to be done. So, you know, clear signals from above. That's really what works best. but what then when this whole ideology and tactics and the way the war is waged is all about, you know, targeting civilians, and so.
So if we turn to Benjamin Ferenczen, or return to him,
Yeah.
and he was a prosecutor during the Nuremberg trials, and there we had commanders at trial, and they were being convicted. Did that have a preventive impact on post-war Europe? Is that the way? Is that kind of what you're both asking for? I'm also looking at you, Robin, that we need to put those in charge and on trial and hold them accountable, because that's a signal to send for the post-conflict society, which is actually what happened in Europe following the Second World War.
What do you think, El? I think that just very briefly, I think Robin's point about, you know, thinking about justice in a broader sense and seeing this as one component of it, I think that's a useful way of going about it, that it has many consequences that are not legal and that are not so tangible. You know, the symbolic value of saying this is wrong, and the kind of the moral necessity of drawing the lines and saying this is something that humanity stands up against. I think that is, you know, one of the very important parts of or aspects of these kinds of trials as well. I'm more skeptical about the preventative power, because historically it has not had much of a, at least measurable effect, I would say. People might disagree with that.
Because these are very different mechanisms at play, as you described here. So Robin, also,
just to add on to that, of course, we're familiar with the moral imperative never again, which is what Adorno said after the war. And we all know, we knew this for decades, that that's empty. We have seen it again. We saw it in the 90s, we're seeing it again now. So then the question is, and this is where you're asking from, Cecilia, what then? You know, what if it hadn't happened? I mean, one could take that counterfactual scenario. What would that have meant about the conception of a political entity, of democracy, rule of law, if there hadn't been Nuremberg? What has come out of Nuremberg? There are also more specific developments. For example, the medical experiments that took place in the death camps have been written now into international bioethical law to protect vulnerable populations. There are problems with that, but it again is something. So I think modest expectations and being aware of the alternative is maybe the best we can have.
Yes. Want to add something, Christian or Astrid? Please, it's your final moment.
Well, I guess I'll raise the flag of pessimism again because, you know, when we're talking about Nuremberg, one could argue that the real European and indeed global tradition is rather one of forgetting than prosecuting and investigating. We could point out that by the early 1950s, because of the Cold War, people were much more interested in forgetting about atrocities committed by the Nazis and building new alliances rather than in prosecuting them. Or since we have Benjamin Ferencz here, he would also be able to tell us that by the early 1950s in the United States, some of the main US prosecutors and lawyers involved in Nuremberg were being attacked by Joseph McCarthy in the US for allegedly being pro-communist, right? So I think that's where my concerns are, that in a very short time after this horrible war ends, there's going to be a lot of other imperatives that are much stronger, like the capitalist imperatives that are a lot stronger than the moral imperatives, and then we'll somehow all find a way to move on until we're sitting here and discussing another set of atrocities.
Thank you. Astrid, do you want a short comment and then...
Just that I favor modest expectations over pessimism, but I think you are, you know, I don't disagree with anything that either of you said. I still, and this is just my, you know, personal belief, think that it's better to do something and to actually try to have these trials, but to have trials that cannot just be written off as victor's justice, but are actually conducted in accordance with the rule of law and the principles that we have for criminal prosecutions. And whether that that will prevent anyone down the line from committing future crimes, I think that's not not a reason not to do it. That we don't actually believe that they will have this preventive effect.
Well, that's a very fine way of ending this seminar. I thank you. I thank our panel and panelists. Thank you so much, and also thank to you. And I think we can give them a hand. And thank you for the questions. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful afternoon.